Our reading today from the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament reading, is taken from 2 Samuel, beginning at chapter 6 and verse 1, verses 1 through 5 and 12 through 19. This is 2 Samuel 6, 1 through 5 and 12 through 19. I would invite you to listen to what the Spirit might speak into your life in this strange reading from 2 Samuel. So always in the summer, the calendar of Bible readings, the lectionary, gives us these maybe obscure readings from the Old Testament, and they're fun to go through and to pick apart and to analyze. Here what's happening is the enemies of the people of God, the enemies of Israel in that time and place, had stolen the Ark of the Covenant, you know, the Ark. We've all seen the movie, which was where God's presence dwelled. And so King David really had to get the ark back, and he got it back because God afflicted the enemies with hemorrhoids. That's actually in the story. And they were so desperate that they gave the ark back, and David is happy. He's had a military victory, yes, but he's gotten the ark of God back. And so this is the story of his rejoicing with the ark. 2 Samuel 6, beginning at verse 1. David again gathered all the chosen people of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set about and went to Judah to bring up the ark of God, which is called the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned upon the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which is on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of a trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came near to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window, this is David's wife, and saw David, King David, leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed all the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among them, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So much anger in the book of 2 Samuel. So many people are angry all the time. There's also jealousy, and there's also desire, and pride, and lust, and fear, and joy. But anger is the emotion that takes center stage today. This part of the Hebrew Scriptures, it's not really concerned with our modern sensitivities. It is gratuitously violent, as was the book of Mark this morning, with all manner of unnecessary bloodshed and dismemberments. But I think the thing that rings true to readers of 2 Samuel is the deep human brokenness and the overwhelming emotions that drive these poor characters, especially anger. In 2 Samuel, it seems like God is always angry. God's always mad about something. Saul and David are always angry, and their testosterone-laden fury, as always, results in needless war and death. And today we see the anger of one of David's wives, a woman named Michal. She's a queen, standing at her window in her palace, watching the king, her husband, David, dancing like a fool in an ephod, a priest's robe. And she hates him. Oh, she hates him. She can't believe she married this guy. Who is this guy dancing like an idiot in a priest's robe in front of everyone? In her lonely window, she stands despising the ridiculous man she married. Let's talk about anger, because there is so much anger in our world today, in our lives and in our hearts. You know, I wrote a newsletter about anger recently, but there's more to the topic than you can say in one page. And frankly, most of you don't read the newsletter. Also, there's just so much anger in our world, in 2 Samuel, in our lives. When have you been really, really mad? Really mad? Crazy mad? Really angry? When I was 14 years old, and as always, I tell you my stories in hopes that they'll ring an echo in your stories. When I was 14 years old, my church youth group was going to a youth convention in Miami, Florida. I was thrilled. I had only ever been in 4 states, and it was only 4 if you count that little strip of West Virginia between Pittsburgh and Ohio. I had crossed that once, the grim northern panhandle of West Virginia. But I wanted to see the globe. I wanted to see every last desert, every last alleyway. I wanted to see the whole thing. I used to sit and read encyclopedias about places I would probably never go, much to the amusement of my parents and siblings, who still mention it sometimes. It was just kind of the 80s equivalent and the 70s equivalent to being on the internet all the time. I mean, Miami didn't hold any special interest for me. I knew they had palm trees in the ocean. But it was a place I'd never been, and I'd been so few places, and I wanted to be in all the places. Plus, we were going to drive the church van from here the whole way down, passing through 6 states. I would get to claim 6 additional states, cross the Appalachian Mountains, be in the South, and see the ocean. This was a big deal for a 14-year-old who wanted to see the world. I had never seen the ocean. I couldn't wait to go to Miami. And we had fundraisers for that mission trip. And I'm not talking about selling pies we didn't make. I'm talking about fundraisers. Our youth director had a barn full of horses. And on the level of the barn where they lived, they couldn't raise their heads the whole way up because there was so much manure on the floor of that barn. And so she decided our fundraiser would be to shovel up the manure, put it into trucks, and to deliver it to people's gardens as fertilizer. I guess, in retrospect, it was a twofer for her. She got her barn cleaned out with free labor, and we got to go to Miami. But it was hard work. And it was smelly, and it was not fun, and it took all day every Saturday in April and May with axes and hoes and shovels. And then when we got there, we had to ride with the manure in the back of the truck to whatever garden we were delivering it to. Then when we got there, we had to spread it on that person's garden evenly with rakes. Mind you, I was 14, but I really wanted to go to Miami. I really wanted to see the world. That trip was in June of 1984. The Eurythmics were on the radio. And I spent nearly every Saturday of April and May cleaning out our youth director's barn and delivering the horse manure as fertilizer. And then 1 week before the trip, 1 week, that youth director, whose barn I had been cleaning out for 2 months, announced that only kids 16 and over could go on the trip, except her 12-year-old son, who did nothing with those fundraisers. He was allowed to go. I was furious. I was absolutely furious. She told me, Brian, you're being selfish. You should be proud to help the older kids go to Miami. We're a group here. This isn't all about individuals. We play as a team. I tried to involve my parents, but that was no use. My father was the pastor, and he always wanted to show that he was not showing favoritism to his own kids. And believe me, nobody ever blamed him of that. So I missed out on Miami and those other 6 states and the Appalachian Mountains and the ocean. And I stayed home, and I seethed with rage. I hated that woman for years and years. I was mad at that youth director for decades, I will say, until one day I learned as an adult that she had died young of cancer. And then I had to go back and revisit my feelings and examine them. And I thought, you know what? I don't know why I've held this rage all this time. It's okay. I have seen the world since. I've seen all but, 9 states, I think. I hold a green card for a country that a lot of people have never heard of. It's okay. I got to see the world after all. I got a later start than I would have liked. But you know what? Just putting this story together to put it into a sermon and writing it all out kind of reawakened my annoyance at a woman who might have had her reasons, a woman who has been dead for a long time, a woman who I actually kind of loved before this happened. It reawakened some of that. And I found some of that anger making its way back. I mean, she used a 14-year-old kid as unpaid labor on her farm with the promise of a trip to Miami that she knew she wasn't going to give him. And she knew his parents weren't going to help. It was deceitful. It was an abuse of trust and power. And it seems like a part of me still holds that. Because isn't that how anger is? Isn't that how forgiveness is? We think we've let it go and we are done with it and we feel so much better, and then years later it might just pop up. It can come on like a forest fire out of nowhere and then disappear like a night dream and be forgotten. But then years later, there it is, it's back. It can be intense and brief. It can be long and brooding. When we say or do something under the influence of anger, we always regret it. And sometimes we feel shame about it. And the deepest, longest lasting anger seems to come from a place deep, deep inside of us. A place where we know that we have no power. And that's the scary thing. We are powerless. And we hate that. We are powerless, and it makes us desperate. It makes us lash out. We have no recourse, no voice, like a 14-year-old kid. And that is what makes revenge look so sweet. And that is what makes revenge look like the solution. We dream of a day when the tables will be turned, when we will be the person in a position of power and the other person will be weak, and we'll be able to let them have theirs. They'll get theirs. The frustration of powerlessness that fuels anger, it also kindles these thoughts of revenge. Feelings of powerlessness are to anger what carbon emissions are to poison ivy. Poison ivy loves our carbon emissions. Have you noticed that? It likes to grow in the suburbs and along the interstates. You don't find it in the big woods up north. You find it down here in the city. It loves all the fumes that make you and me choke, just like anger. Anger is the same. Now, I have given you a fairly harmless example of one instance in my life when I have been very angry. And in the great scheme of things, I was a very privileged victim. I was not a prisoner at Abu Ghraib. I was not a civilian in Gaza. I was not kidnapped or trafficked or physically harmed. I wasn't even emotionally abused in this instance. Many people have it a whole lot worse. There are people in this room and people in this world who have cause for anger far greater than I do in that situation. And so what do we do about the anger that flares up in our hearts and flares up in our world in crazy, unpredictable ways, like what we saw yesterday. What do we do about all the anger? In both of our scripture readings today, we encounter individuals who are just choking on their anger. Both of them happen to be women, Michal and Herodias. First is Michal. She is the wife of King David. Her father had been the king, King Saul, who lost favor and fell from grace. But Michal grew up in a royal palace, or at least a royal tent. Her father went a little crazy and got himself killed. Her husband was the new king, but he had grown up as a shepherd. He didn't quite know how to go about the niceties of being a king. He doesn't know how to comport himself with royal dignity. Look at him out there in the streets, dancing like a fool, like a court jester, in a priest's robe, celebrating his military victory. You know, the text doesn't tell us all the reasons Michal hates David, her husband. Maybe it really is just his unseemly behavior. Maybe she's embarrassed by him, the way he acts. Maybe it's because his fortunes have risen and her father's fortunes have fallen. Maybe his buffoonery is just one more thing in a long list that she's been keeping, like where he puts his toothbrush when he's done brushing his teeth. Things like that. You know, the things in a marriage that work on your nerves. Maybe it's his coarseness, his simplicity, his love of the spotlight, for he did love the spotlight. And you know how marriage works. The things that you find endearing in the beginning sometimes become the things you find annoying later on. But look at Michal in her lonely window, standing outside the festivities, looking on as an outsider. Something in her won't let her take part, or maybe she's not wanted, I don't know. She feels excluded from the crowds, from the joy, from her own spouse. Powerless and alone. That is a perfect recipe for anger. She's powerless, she's alone. And then in Mark, we have Queen Herodias, who is so angry at John the Baptist. This is crazy rage, that she has his head cut off and given to her daughter on a plate. I don't think I've ever been that angry. Or maybe there's something more going on there than just anger. Now look, there's something true in scriptures that we see frequently, and that is that women are scapegoated for the misbehaviors of men. Women are often blamed for the moral failings of men. We find it throughout. But what do these two individuals really have in common? Powerlessness, or feelings of powerlessness, desperation. Michal and Herodias still haunt our world today as well as our hearts. We find them wherever someone is powerless and mad about it. We find it wherever there are marginalized people, unwanted people, disempowered people, looking on from their solitary window, excluded from the party, on the outside looking in, cut off from the singing and the dancing of others, choking on their rage and their misfortune and not knowing what to do about it. We must find healthy ways to deal with all this anger. Anger in our world, anger in ourselves. I mean, think about the angriest people in the world today, the angriest people in our nation. Aren't most of them a lot like Michal and Herodias? They have not been invited to the party. These are people who have long been standing alone in their windows, looking on the party from the outside. Aren't they the angry ones? The ones that have been systemically excluded from decision-making, the ones who feel unwanted, unaccepted, without power. Alienation, the feeling of not mattering, the idea that there's no place for you at the table and you have no voice, that makes people angry. But as we know and as we're always hearing, anger is a secondary emotion, just like green is a secondary color. Just as it takes two primary colors, blue and yellow, to make green, so it takes a mix of deeper emotions to make anger. And fear, I think, is often one of them. Fear plus being excluded or feeling excluded equals anger. Fear plus feeling like you don't matter equals anger. Fear plus feeling unwanted equals anger, rejected, powerless, voiceless, with no recourse. All of these create anger, and we cannot blame people for their anger when it is born of so much pain and so much exclusion, being left out of the party to which you and I were invited. Anger, too, can be a cover for deeper sorrows like sadness and guilt and shame, and a real deep down belief that, yes, I am less than everybody else. Maybe I really am inferior. Exclusion. That is at the root of so much anger in our world today and in our society, exclusion. Anger is never just anger. There's always something beneath the surface of anger, lurking. Imagine this in 2 Samuel. Imagine how different the story would have been if dancing David had taken Michal into his arms and said, "Listen, honey, there's going to be a dance tonight. I know you hate these. Things are going to get a little silly and it's not going to be your thing, but I'd love it if you could be there with me." And even if she hated the dancing, she would have loved being included in the whole thing. Might be fun. Simple inclusion is sometimes the solution to anger. But no, not David. David always had to have center stage. He was a man of the people, a charismatic guy who belonged to everyone except his spouse. Any spouse would be angry. You know, the book of Proverbs says a gentle answer turns away wrath. And that's true. That is a good proverb. A gentle answer turns away wrath. What do we do when faced with the wrath of people around us? Because there's so much. It's so misguided. It's explosive. It's violent. We don't always know when we're going to trip on the anger of others. When faced with someone else's anger, I think the best response is to sympathize. And it's hard, because when I see anger in you, it awakens the anger in me, or else the fear. But what if we tried to guess the mix of emotions that is creating the anger in them? We might guess wrong, but even just trying to understand an angry person humanizes them and makes us feel for them and makes us identify, to some degree, with them. Trying to understand another person can go a long way toward diffusing their anger, at least insofar as it's directed toward you. If people felt heard, I think they would be a whole lot less angry and a whole lot less desperate. And what about the anger in us? What about that anger that builds its fortress in our minds and in our hearts and that takes up residence for years and decades in our lives? Whole lifetimes. What do we do with our own anger? Anger has the power to poison not just our hearts and minds, but our bodies, making us sick. There are a few things we can do to get over anger. One, I find sometimes when I tell that story about my youth director, I dramatize it. I make her worse than she really was. And I make myself more innocent and more helpless than I really was. And I make my parents into fall guys in that story. I probably am not helping myself with my anger by the way I tell that story. I'm probably not being fair to anyone, including myself, by the way I tell that story. There could have been more to it than I know. Maybe I knew more than I thought I knew going in. Maybe there were assumptions. Who knows? I could give the benefit of the doubt, and that might make me a little less angry. about something that happened a long time ago. There might be more to this story than I know or can tell. Maybe the way I tell the story is not helping my anger. 2, this I love to do. We can create a positive mantra to tell ourselves. These are very effective. This is kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy. You think up something bright and positive to say over to yourself. In my case, if I were not a minister, I would say, all's well that ends well. I got to see the world. I didn't get to see it at the age of 14. It's okay. No harm done. No harm, no foul. All's well that ends well. I could use that mantra over and again every time I try to be angry at that poor woman who's been dead these many years. In my own case, I prefer Colossians 3:3. Your life is hidden with Christ in God. My life is part of God's life. It's all wrapped up in God's life. It has a plan, I guess. It has meaning. The timing of it matters. And so maybe that wasn't the time I was supposed to go to Miami. I don't even like it all that much. After all these years, Miami. The timing wasn't right. But my life is part of God's life. Your life is hidden with Christ in God, and so it's okay. God's timing matters. No harm done. A mantra like that can really help us to heal by reinforcing what is positive and what is good. All's well that ends well. 3rd, and I said this in the newsletter article, poetry and music are so effective in helping us to deal with our anger as long as the poetry and the music are not angry. As long as they're bright and positive. Or at least, maybe they just sing your sorrow and sing your frustration. Open the book of the Psalms, which is all poetry, at any page, and you'll find every emotion you're feeling right there on one of those 2 pages in front of you. Anger, bitterness, joy, worship. It's all right there. So poetry and music, they call us outside of everything that's ugly and broken and small, and they invite us to focus on the eternal beauty in our lives and in our world. And we can pray. You know, prayer has an effect, especially when we're not asking for anything. Prayer has a healing effect when all we're really doing is dwelling in God's presence. And finally, what if, just keep an open mind here, what if we actually embraced our powerlessness? What if we actually accepted and welcomed the fact that we are not in control? That we cannot be in control, that if we were in control, we would not want the job. We are not in control of most things that affect us. We can rejoice in that. We can find it both terrifying and liberating. What if we cast ourselves and everyone we love on the great love that we have called God, but which goes by so many names? To recap, let us deal with our anger, 1, by asking if the way we're telling ourselves the story is not making it worse. 2, by coming up with a positive mantra to repeat to ourselves to make us less angry. 3, by turning to art, to music, to poetry. 4, by praying. And 5, and perhaps most importantly, embracing our powerlessness. You know, we never get to hear the end of the story for Michal or for Herodias. I hope they found healing. I hope they found relief from their anger. And we see a God in the Bible who is often quite angry, but that's not the God we see in the person of Jesus, is it? The angry God isn't the God we see in Jesus. In Jesus, we see a God of welcome and peace and joy. So it is with God, and let it be so with us. Amen.